and our classroom is officially in session. Lee & Low is the largest and most trusted multicultural children's book publisher in the U.S. A family-run, independent, and certified 100% minority-owned business enterprise, Lee & Low produces high-quality books about everyone for everyone, along with free educator resources to make meaningful use of each book in today's classroom. Email quotes@leeandlow.com today to start building a custom collection tailored to your unique needs, goals, and budget. Hey, what's good, peeps? Roberto here with Lorena once again.
Hello.
How you feeling, Lorena?
I'm okay. I'm tired.
It's all good. It's all good.
But I'm happy to be talking about this today.
Talking about what?
Socio-political context.
Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Can you explain what teaching socio-political context means and why it's important in education?
Yes, it is very important, and I'll get to why in a second. But what it is it's essentially the idea of teaching around a concept or a text. So let's say you were teaching a book. And often what we'll do is we'll be like, okay, well, who was the author and when was it written? When were they born? And that gives you some info. But we have to go a little bit deeper to understand the time period. What was going on in that author's life? What from their upbringing maybe impacted them or caused them to write this thing? What does it mean to read a book about this topic at this time for me in this moment, right? So for example, let's say that you read a book about immigration and maybe like refugees in 1991. That has one impact. But what if you read that same book, right, with a class or by yourself in 2017, right, at the height of, right after the campaign and these claims and the stuff happening at the border between Mexico and the U.S., right, like reading it there, that would have a different impact on the reader. That's what socio-political context means. The same happens with a concept, right? Like what if I'm learning about the let's say Confederacy and the Civil War and the statues. It's one thing to have read that in 1989, and it's another one to have read it in 2019 when they were knocking down Confederate statues all across the United States, right? And so socio-political context is the stuff, if you will, the meat or the academics, the research, the context around a particular concept or a text. And I hope that in of itself shows why it matters, but it matters because we have way too many people that are talking about different things in society at their dinner table, on podcasts, in books, on social media, and they just do not have the socio-political understanding of the meaning of things, right? When someone says something like, oh, I'm not PC, I don't care about PC language, right? Which is political correctness. What they're saying actually is, I don't understand the socio-political meaning of this word or this idea. And so that's kind of the short of it. I think that
or maybe they do understand it, but they don't want to get into it.
That's a whole different thing.
Because it makes them feel a particular way. They don't want to wrestle with the discomfort.
Yeah, for sure. But we have to have these conversations.
You mentioned that teaching socio-political context is a skill builder for students.
Yeah.
In the blog post that you wrote. Can you elaborate on how it fosters deep learning and social emotional development?
Yeah. So it is skill building because we need that in order to do some meaningful analytical work, right? I could analyze a concept or a particular idea in an academic concept, like a content-based thing, right? So like, let's say in science, we're studying the cardiovascular system. We could analyze some stuff about that, like by thinking critically, by saying, well, what positively impacts the heart so that you can have a, effective and healthy cardiovascular system. So that's one way to go, but you could also just go deeper by thinking sociopolitically, by thinking sociologically. That's another way to think about that, right? And so I could be having that same conversation about the cardiovascular system and the role of the heart and all that stuff. But I could then say, well, how does, environmental racism impact the heart? How do food deserts impact the condition of the heart? And how might that play a role in the cardiovascular system of the people in that community, for example, right? And so those are the ways that we can embed sociology, we can embed socio-political context into all of these conversations so that we can actually do more meaningful skill building work that goes beyond the test. Yes, we're back to the test. And then how is this related to SEL or social emotional learning? In every single way, right? Like if I am learning things at school that help me process who I am and what I'm seeing in my own community and neighborhood, immediately that helps me with certain skills around like self-management, self-awareness, collective responsibility, things like that can help me just engage with others better and process the things I'm feeling too.
Good stuff. The blog you wrote emphasizes that teaching socio-political context respects voices and is restorative. Can you provide examples of how this is implemented in educational settings?
Yeah. So teaching socio-political context absolutely welcomes often excluded voices because you focus on the complexity of situations and topics, right? So instead of continuing to learn the same thing from the same point of view, what you're doing is adding nuance and welcoming complexity by bringing in additional voices that curriculum has often excluded. And so by doing that, you are already you're respecting voices, you are honoring experiences. That act in and of itself is restorative. So a student who is sitting there is like, man, this teacher is really considering who I am, is considering my community, this place where I live, that I leave this school each day and go to, right? My neighborhood, like this teacher is considering these points of view. So what are some examples, right? So let's take that cardiovascular example because I'm already on it. What's a way to bring in voices and respect voices and to do that in a restorative way? Well, by considering that environmental racism, right, that I mentioned, maybe you bring in a doctor from that community virtually or in person to talk a little bit about the ways that the food deserts are actually impacting the healthy food choices that people have access to, right, in that very community. And so that way you're already doing some restorative, even like social justice work by helping kids develop awareness and identify these problems and name what they're experiencing. More examples. Maybe you're doing a unit on the water cycle. I'm going with science today. I was working at a school and we were talking a lot about science today. So let's say you're doing the water cycle, right? And similarly, you're going to center the community. This is also all like texture teaching. That's what I'm talking about here. But anyway, you're studying the water cycle with some little people, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade. And what you want to do is spend some time thinking and understanding the pollution in the community, right? Like what is going on in this neighborhood, and how is it that we don't get the support we need from our local government or our state government? But this is actually a diverse but working class community. And so now we can have actually a conversation around access to resources and funding and economics, right? We can talk about how working class people, even though we're the ones holding up the economy, right, in our local communities, we're not the ones that are necessarily benefiting from living in conditions that are going to improve our quality of life. So these are some ways to do some of that socio-political work. But fine, let's turn to literature, right? Let's say you're reading a book and, something like, for example, let me think, like The Hate You Give, right? If I were to be doing a unit on The Hate You Give, which I have, I don't stop at simply, let's study this and Black Lives Matter, right? Because obviously there's references to it. But actually, let's get into a conversation around the history of policing in the United States. How did we get here? What do police officers, what are their takes on some of this? How can I find some video? How can I discuss what it's like to write this book in this time? Who is Angie Thomas, the author, and what does she believe? What does she, what is her role, her identity, maybe her upbringing? What role does that play in this book? Why was this book published at this time, etc.? Like, what is the sociological context or the socio-political context for this book? You know, and one of the things to know is that, for example, hip hop was a big influence for her, continues to be. She was growing up during the 90s riots, the early ones, right? And so she, you know, after Rodney King and everything that happened there. And so that has directly impacted what she writes, why she writes, and how she writes it. So that's deeper than simply identifying theme or symbol or conflicts between the police and Khalil and Star, you know?
That's good. That's good. Thanks for that breakdown. And there's a clear distinction made between teaching socio-political context and engaging in partisanship or promoting specific political ideologies.
Yes, thank you for that clarification.
Could you delve deeper into this differentiation for our listeners?
Absolutely. So partisanship, meaning political parties, that completely has nothing to do with any of this. Notice that I haven't mentioned politics once. I haven't mentioned Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, because none of that is necessarily relevant to these conversations. This is not about guiding kids to believe in one party or another, to pick a particular candidate for some political thing. Absolutely not. This is completely about understanding the human condition, quality of life, and the way that society works in this country around particular issues. That's all it is. It's equipping young people with the skills they need to be able to go out and be productive and to be problem solvers, to be community builders and you know, solution oriented, which might not lead them at all to a life of politics, you know?
True. And I'm sure there's going to be some folks who just see the title or come up on the phrase socio-political and they're going to trip off of that.
Right.
Because people don't take the time to understand the context.
Yeah. Can I just say something real quick about that? Because semantics is important, right? Like folks are legislating against particular words and phrases. If sociopolitical context is touchy and you're like, I don't want to do that, call it sociological, or just call it like a deeper analysis. I mean, it really doesn't matter
of
what
the human condition.
Right, like anything, right? You can call it anything. Oh, I want to understand more about when this book was published. Call it a study of time and setting. I don't care. As long as you're doing the work, right, of this sociological, if you need to use that, right? Like, what is the sociology around?
Some people don't like that either.
Why?
And keep in mind, in Florida, they're trying to get they're trying to get rid of or have gotten rid of that sociology programs on the university level.
Yeah, you're right. Fine, whatever. Use other language. It doesn't matter. Or don't even use language. Keep calling it.
Or just use the language.
Which one?
This same language, because the folks that gonna trip, they're gonna trip.
Right.
They're gonna hear, no matter how we try to mask it, the folks that are on the side of resistance.
Yeah.
They're gonna continue to resist.
Yeah.
You know, their hearts are hardened. They like don't even take the time to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't even get you to the table, which is part of the mission. Let's get to the table. Let's talk through our differences.
Mm-hmm.
You know. We ain't always right, but we definitely ain't always wrong.
Yeah. I mean, another phrasing too, or because it also can help to visualize. So there's this image, this concept that I share in the Anti-Racist Teacher, well, in the second edition, it's not in the first one, where I talk about a concept that my professor shared with me when I was in graduate school, which was around teaching within, around, and against a text. So within is for like searching for meaning, right? Understanding, comprehending. Going against the text is critiquing it and what's missing and right, like just asking questions around it. And then teaching or understanding around the text, reading around the text is what I am describing here. What was going on around the time of creation of this text, publication, and even reading of the text? Because the book could have been written in 1922, but I'm reading it today and it has a different impact, right? So all of those, like teaching around a text, that's another way that you can describe this, or background building even. Like there's so much language that we can use.
What professor was that?
Dr. David Kirkland.
Shout out to Kirk.
Yeah.
Shout out to Dr. Kirkland. What up? So, could you share some insights from your book, Textured Teaching?
Right.
Textured Teaching, folks, if you don't have that, you need that. It is a framework for culturally sustaining pedagogies.
Yeah.
Can you share some insight from your book, particularly the chapter that focuses on teaching socio-political context?
Yeah, I think the best, like the best chapter that's going to speak to this is the chapter, chapter 3 on interdisciplinary teaching and learning. That is where I spend time outlining a 3-step process for actually how to do that. I go over how to get into topics, what to research, what does it mean to have these touchy words and taboo words that people don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about. How do I address that? How do I bring in critical thinking? Like, I just break it down all the way. So I would say that chapter, interdisciplinary teaching and learning. Yeah.
And how does teaching socio-political context intersect with culturally relevant teaching practices?
Oh, absolutely.
Or culturally sustaining?
Right. So one of the tenets of, or let me use another word because that's used for critical race theory. So one of the elements of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings' framework includes developing consciousness among young people. Right. And so doing this actually helps them to also develop a sense of consciousness when they're reading as readers, their own bias, the text bias, the author's bias. And bias isn't even necessarily a bad concept here, but just like kind of what we walk in with, right? Like, this book is about X. Yeah, well, it's written in the United States. That's a particular lens, right? Or it's written by a woman. That's a particular lens. And then who is this author? Oh, this author's from the South. Well, that's a particular lens. Oh, I am reading this, but I'm from the North and I'm a male, right? Okay, well, that's a particular lens. And so all of that actually goes into culturally relevant teaching because it very strictly falls into the framework, but it also helps the teacher and the student engage in this kind of relationship, if you will, with the learning, where it's very much humanized. It's like, who are you? Who am I? What is this space we're in? What is this thing we're trying to do, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, hey, folks, if you're looking to integrate socio-political context into your teaching, once again, I highly recommend Textured Teaching.
Yes.
A framework for culturally sustaining pedagogies.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll leave you with that. Lorena, any final words before we wrap up?
Can I shout out a couple other books too?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, okay. So I would add to that list. Let me see, Sarah Ahmed's Be the Change, because there she does a lot of work on that identity piece, which I think could be really useful in getting into some of those conversations.
Yeah, we should have Sarah Ahmed on the podcast.
I know. Now that I think about it, I would also shout out Kim Parker's book. She does a lot of good work there. I know, on like these small groups and how to bring this work. I think it could just it could be really helpful to these types of conversations. I would also shout out
and Dr. Parker's book is Literacy is Liberation.
Yes.
Dr. Kim Parker. Literacy is Liberation. Right. Working toward justice through culturally relevant teaching.
Yep. I would also, I think that there's some really good and relevant ideas in Carla and Luz's En Comunidad. They're talking specifically about Latina immigrant and emergent bilingual students.
And those are lessons for centering the voices and experience of bilingual Latinx students.
Right. And I think it's relevant because it helps you do think through some of that teacher-facing work, right? Like, what is it like for me to walk in here with a particular demographic? I'd have to think about some more books, though, around teaching socio-political context. But I think a bunch of a lot of these social studies books, too, could be really helpful.
All right. Well, we gave y'all a few resources that you can tap into if you haven't already. We appreciate you listening to this episode of the podcast, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
As always, your engagement in our classroom is greatly appreciated. Be sure to subscribe, rate the show, and write a review. Finally, for resources to help you understand the intersection of race, bias, education, and society, go to multiculturalclassroom.com. Peace and love from your host, Roberto Germán.